The gas station stood in the middle of a quiet street, its lights flickering gently in the cool evening air. It was a familiar place for many locals, a pit stop on their way home after long days at work or errands. On this particular night, a woman pulled up to the pump in her sleek black car. She had just finished a long shift and was looking forward to heading home, hoping for a peaceful end to her day. She had done this 1,000 times before, without any issues. Just a quick stop to fill her tank, then back on the road. But tonight something felt different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the atmosphere seemed charged with tension. Maybe it was just the weight of the day catching up with her. Maybe it was the late hour. Or maybe it was the fact that the air around her seemed thicker than usual. As she began pumping the gas, she noticed a police car pull into the station. The officer, a man in his 40s with a stern face and a no-nonsense attitude, got out of his car and started walking in her direction. She didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was a public place, and officers often stopped by for a break or to check on things. But this officer's eyes were fixed on her, and as he approached, she felt an uneasy sense of being watched. She didn't let it show, though. She continued filling her tank, pretending as if she hadn't noticed him. Her body was tense, but she kept her expression neutral. It was the only way to deal with people who seemed to carry an air of judgment like this officer did. "Excuse me, ma'am." The officer's voice broke through the silence. It wasn't loud, but there was something sharp about it, something that made her pause. She turned to face him, setting the nozzle back in its place. "Yes, officer. I need to ask you a few questions," he said, his tone less friendly than she had expected. "What are you doing here at this hour?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "I'm just filling up my tank," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm on my way home from work." The officer didn't seem satisfied with that answer. He looked at her suspiciously, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you have your ID with you?" At first she didn't understand. "I'm just getting gas," she said again, her tone becoming a little firmer. "There's no need for my ID." But the officer wasn't hearing her. His gaze remained fixed on her as if he was waiting for her to do something wrong. The seconds stretched on and her discomfort grew. She felt the familiar sinking feeling that she had encountered before, in places she didn't expect. Places where her skin color made her an automatic target for suspicion. This officer didn't know her, didn't know anything about her, yet there was something in his eyes that told her he already had her figured out. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cold now, "I need to see your ID." She hesitated, then sighed. This wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, but it didn't make it any easier. She reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet and handing him her ID. She didn't understand why it was necessary. After all, she had done nothing wrong, but she complied. It was easier this way, less of a hassle. The officer took her ID without saying another word and began studying it, his face unreadable. For a moment, there was only the sound of the gas pump clicking off as her tank filled. She stood there waiting for him to finish his inspection, her mind racing. What was it about her that made people like him act this way? It wasn't just the police. She had felt the weight of suspicion all her life, in small ways and big ways, simply because of the color of her skin. She tried to shake it off, to focus on something else. But then the officer spoke again. "You're not from around here, are you?" His question was pointed as if there was something wrong with not belonging. "No, I'm not," she replied, her voice steady, though her irritation was growing. "I work in the city." The officer grunted, his eyes still glued to her ID. "I see," he said, his tone still laced with skepticism. "You know, this area isn't exactly safe for people like you at night." The words hit her like a slap. She had heard them before, but hearing them now in this moment made the insult sting all over again. It wasn't just the fact that he was judging her. It was the assumption that she didn't belong, that she wasn't safe here, as if her very presence was an inconvenience or a threat. "I'm just getting gas," she said, her voice tight now. "I'm not doing anything illegal." The officer seemed unmoved by her words. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence intimidating. "I'm going to need to search your car." Her heart raced. This wasn't right. She had done nothing to warrant a search, but she knew better than to argue. People like him didn't take kindly to being challenged. Still, something in her snapped. "No," she said firmly, taking a step back. "You don't have any reason to search my car. I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer's eyes flashed, and for a moment there was a tense silence between them. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, the frustration at being treated like this yet again. The way he was looking at her, the way he was trying to assert control over her, it was too much. Without warning, he moved towards her, his hand raised as if to grab her arm. Her instincts kicked in, and before she even realized what was happening, she pushed him away, her voice rising with the force of her words. "Don't touch me," she shouted, stepping back. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to maintain control of the situation. She had been through enough to know when things were about to get out of hand. The officer stumbled back, his expression turning from one of cold authority to one of surprise. But that moment of hesitation didn't last long. Without warning, the officer raised his fist and punched her square in the face. The pain was sharp, sudden. She staggered backward, her head spinning for a moment. Blood began to trickle from her lip, but she didn't fall. Instead, she stood there, shocked and enraged. How could this be happening? What the officer didn't know was that she wasn't just anyone at this gas station. She was an FBI agent working undercover on a surveillance mission. Her calm demeanor had been part of the job. She had learned to keep her emotions in check. But in that moment, with the punch still fresh on her face, her training kicked in. She didn't panic. She didn't cry out. Instead, she quietly assessed the situation, her mind already working to figure out what to do next. The officer was still standing there, his eyes wide in disbelief. He hadn't realized who she was, but he would soon learn the hard way. The pain from the punch was sharp, but the woman refused to let it take control. She took a steadying breath, wiping the blood from her lip with the back of her hand. The officer was standing a few feet away, his hand still raised as if unsure of what to do next. His shock was clear on his face, but it didn't change the fact that he had just crossed a line. She knew he had made a dangerous mistake, but she also knew he had no idea who he had just struck. The woman stood tall, even as the world around her seemed to blur for a moment. The blood on her lip didn't bother her as much as the injustice of the situation. She had been in many tense moments in her life, but never had she been so blatantly targeted. Her mind was calm, even though her body was screaming with adrenaline. Her fingers instinctively brushed the hidden device on her waist, a small button that would alert her team that something was wrong. It was a simple mechanism, but it was one she had come to trust over the years of her work as an undercover FBI agent. If everything went according to plan, they would be here in minutes. The officer, still standing there, hadn't realized the magnitude of his actions yet. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice cold but controlled. "You don't know who I am." The officer blinked, clearly confused by her words. His eyes shifted between her and the now distant hum of his police car. He had never expected this. He had thought she was just another person to intimidate, someone to assert his authority over. But he hadn't bothered to look beyond his own biases. If he had, he would have known that he was dealing with someone who wasn't just going to stand there and take it. "I don't know who you think you are," the officer muttered, his voice shaking now, "but you don't push a cop like that." The woman's eyes narrowed. The officer's words only confirmed what she had already suspected. He hadn't recognized the danger of the situation. He was still seeing her through the lens of his prejudices, assuming that her race and gender made her an easy target. What he didn't know was that she had been trained for moments just like this one. "You shouldn't have hit me," she said calmly, each word precise and measured. "But you will soon learn who I am." She could see his hands twitching, as though he wanted to reach for his radio or his weapon, but he hesitated. The uncertainty in his eyes was palpable. His posture was no longer one of superiority, but one of doubt. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't just any woman he had punched. Something about her presence, her demeanor, was shifting the balance of power in this interaction. And then, in the distance, she heard the faint sound of sirens. Her heart raced a little faster, but she kept her face neutral. The officers she worked with were trained to respond quickly, especially when an undercover agent was in danger. She had pushed a button in her car moments before the officer had struck her, and now they were on their way. It wouldn't be long before the situation escalated even further for the officer who had made the mistake of underestimating her. He shifted his weight, eyes darting between her and his car where his own radio was. He seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that he had overstepped. But it was too late now. He had already made a critical error, one that would not be so easily forgotten. The woman remained still, keeping her face impassive. She knew the drill. She had dealt with much worse in her time as an agent. The constant fear of being discovered, the pressure of maintaining her cover, the moments when everything seemed like it was about to fall apart. But she had never been this close to having her cover blown because of someone else's recklessness. As the sirens grew louder, the officer's hand moved to his waist, fingers brushing over his weapon. But before he could make any further moves, the headlights of several cars appeared, cutting through the darkness. Two vehicles, marked with the unmistakable FBI insignia, screeched to a halt at the gas station. The woman didn't flinch. She was used to these moments, the controlled chaos of a team arriving just in time, pulling things back from the edge. From the first car, two agents rushed toward her, their eyes quickly scanning the situation. They immediately focused on the officer, recognizing the danger of the situation. One agent reached her side, his eyes quickly assessing her and offering a brief nod. His attention then shifted to the officer, who had visibly paled, realizing that the game had changed. "You've made a very serious mistake," the agent said, his voice firm but not aggressive. The officer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked between the two agents and the woman, who stood there silently, her expression unreadable. "You're under arrest for assault," the agent continued, stepping closer, "and for racial profiling, harassment, and more, depending on how the investigation goes." The officer's face turned crimson as the words sunk in. He had been caught red-handed. He opened his mouth, his voice a mixture of disbelief and panic. "But I didn't know," he stammered, his words losing their coherence. "It doesn't matter," the agent said, cutting him off. "You've assaulted an officer of the law, and now you're going to have to answer for it." The woman stepped back, letting the agents handle the situation. She didn't need to say anything else. Her colleagues had arrived, and now the officer's fate was sealed. His actions had been reckless, and they had put her in danger. But more importantly, he had made the grave mistake of underestimating her. As the officer was placed in handcuffs, he continued to stutter, clearly unable to process what had just happened. The woman stood quietly, watching as her team began to gather evidence. They moved quickly, professionally, and efficiently. She knew they had already begun gathering all the details they needed for the investigation. The officer's career would likely be over, and if things went as they should, he would face criminal charges as well. For the woman, it was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. The bruises on her face were physical reminders of the injustice she had faced, but the true victory came in knowing that the system would hold the officer accountable for his actions. She would continue her work, keeping her focus on the bigger picture. This was just one battle in a much larger fight, and she had come out on top. She glanced around at her team, her colleagues who had her back when things went wrong. They were her family, and together they fought for justice, for the truth. This moment was a reminder of why they did what they did, to stand up for the innocent, to fight back against the biases that ruled too many corners of society, and to ensure that those who abused their power would be held accountable. As the officer was led away, the woman's thoughts turned to the future. She had seen firsthand the effects of unchecked authority, the kind of power that was dangerous in the wrong hands. But she also knew that this was a victory, however small, in the battle for equality and justice. The days that followed were filled with intense reflection. The woman had never expected an ordinary stop at a gas station to turn into such a pivotal moment in her life. The incident with the officer had stirred something deep within her, a mix of anger, disbelief, and a deep sense of responsibility. She had always known that the work she did was dangerous, that there were moments when things could spiral out of control. But this was different. This wasn't just an attack on her as an agent. It was a reminder of the ugly truth that racism and prejudice were still deeply ingrained in many parts of society, even in places where they shouldn't be. She spent the following days surrounded by her team, reviewing the evidence, working with lawyers, and making sure the officer's actions wouldn't be brushed under the rug. The FBI took incidents like this seriously, but it still felt like an uphill battle. The officer had been an authoritative figure, and in many ways he was the embodiment of the system that perpetuated the kind of behavior she had faced. But she wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Not after everything that had happened. The team had collected body camera footage from the officer's car, as well as the recordings from the gas station's security cameras. They also had statements from her colleagues who had witnessed everything unfold when they arrived. The evidence was solid, but there was still a sense of disbelief on her part. How could someone in a position of power act like that? How could anyone think they had the right to treat another human being like that, simply because of the color of their skin? It was a question that weighed heavily on her mind. For years she had worked undercover, navigating the world with her own personal armor, a careful balance of blending in while also staying true to the mission. It wasn't easy, but she had always kept a sense of purpose, knowing that her job was about more than just the task at hand. It was about fighting for justice, standing up for what was right, and confronting the biases that so often went unnoticed. But this incident had thrown her into a whirlwind. The officer's actions had made her question everything she knew about the system. She had seen it up close, the way the law could be manipulated, how power could be used for control. She had seen firsthand how people like her were often treated as second-class citizens, how their voices were ignored or silenced, and this officer's blatant assault on her only reinforced those painful truths. Despite all of this, she refused to let it break her. She was stronger than that. She knew her worth, and she knew that her work, her mission, was more important than ever. This was about something bigger than just her. It was about all those who had been wronged, about the countless people who had been unjustly targeted by those who wore badges of power. It was about bringing those who abused that power to justice, making sure that the system was held accountable for its failings. The investigation into the officer's actions moved swiftly. The community was outraged, and public support grew as more details emerged. The video footage showed the clear escalation of the situation, and the officer's violent reaction to her was undeniable. The case quickly became a media sensation, with many calling for reforms within the police force. It was a moment of reckoning for everyone involved, a chance to shine a light on the cracks in the system that needed to be addressed. For the woman, though, the media attention was bittersweet. She had never sought the spotlight. Her work was always about the mission, about getting the job done without drawing attention to herself. But now she was a face on the news, her story being dissected in public forums. The support she received from the community was overwhelming, but it was also a constant reminder of what had happened, of what the officer had done to her. It made her feel vulnerable in ways she hadn't felt before. But despite the discomfort, she knew that the spotlight was necessary. It was the only way to bring about change. The officer, now facing charges of assault, racial profiling, and excessive use of force, was placed on administrative leave while the investigation proceeded. It wasn't long before he was fired. His career had come to a swift and brutal end. But for the woman, it wasn't about his punishment. It was about making sure that this kind of behavior didn't go unchallenged. She wanted to make sure that no one else would have to face what she had gone through, and that future generations wouldn't have to fight the same battles. One evening, as she sat in her apartment reviewing case files, she received a call from her supervisor. His voice was serious, and she could tell he had something important to say. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his tone compassionate but professional. "I'm fine," she replied, even though she wasn't sure that was true. "Just keeping busy, making sure everything's in order." "Good," he said. "Listen, we've received word that there's going to be a public hearing about the incident. It's going to be televised. We want you to be there." Her heart skipped a beat. A public hearing. The thought of being in front of a crowd, of reliving the incident for everyone to see, made her stomach twist with nerves. But she couldn't back down now. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let fear hold her back. "I'll be there," she said, her voice steady, though the reality of it was settling in. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the entire system, about the changes that needed to be made. She had a responsibility now, to speak out, to be the voice for those who had been silenced, to stand up for what was right. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with preparation. She met with lawyers, reviewed the evidence, and practiced her testimony. The pressure mounted with each passing day. She knew the weight of this moment. She knew that her words would be scrutinized, that every part of her story would be dissected in public. But the more she thought about it, the more determined she became. This wasn't just about her experience, it was about changing the way the system worked. It was about accountability, about showing the world that those who abused their power could not escape the consequences. On the day of the hearing, she walked into the building with her head held high, her heart pounding in her chest. As she entered the room, the eyes of the public and the media followed her every move. She could feel the weight of their gaze, but she didn't let it shake her. She was there for a reason, and she wasn't going to back down. The room was tense, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The hearing was broadcast live, and millions of people were watching. She sat at the witness table, her hands resting on the surface, steady and controlled. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, but she focused on the task ahead. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath and stood. Her voice was steady, clear and unwavering as she began to tell her story. About that night at the gas station, about the officer's actions, and about what it meant to be targeted in such a way. She spoke from the heart, telling the truth without hesitation. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She didn't try to make the situation seem less painful than it was. She spoke about the fear, the anger, and the sense of betrayal that had filled her when the officer had struck her. But she also spoke about her strength, her determination to fight back, and her belief in justice. As she finished her testimony, there was a long silence in the room. It was as if everyone was holding their breath. And then, one by one, the members of the panel began to nod. They understood. They saw the truth in her words. The hearing was a success. It was a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone who had suffered because of bias and abuse of power. The hearing would go down in history as a significant moment in the fight for justice. For the woman, it was a bittersweet victory. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. She knew that, but she was ready. Because now she had a voice, and she was going to use it. The hearing had been a success, but it wasn't over yet. The woman, though proud of her testimony, couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a long way to go. While the panel had acknowledged her words, the real work had only just begun. There was a public conversation now. A conversation about police accountability, racial profiling, and systemic injustice. She knew this moment would be remembered, but she also understood that memories fade and change was hard to come by. The following weeks were a whirlwind of media attention. News outlets covered the story, focusing not just on the incident itself but on the broader implications of what had happened. It was a rare moment in which someone in her position, an undercover FBI agent, had become a public face for an issue that affected so many others. The woman found herself speaking to reporters, sharing her experience and discussing the need for reform. She didn't like the spotlight, but she understood its importance. This wasn't about her. It was about the message that needed to be heard. Despite the overwhelming support from the public, there was also a wave of backlash. Some questioned her actions, accusing her of exaggerating the situation, of playing the victim. The internet, as always, was a battleground of opinions, with some people dismissing her story entirely. She was prepared for this. She knew that not everyone would understand. But it still stung. It reminded her of the deep divisions that still existed in society, of the prejudices that colored people's perceptions of one another. Even in the face of the truth, there were those who refused to see it. But the woman was resilient. She had learned long ago that not everyone would be on her side, and that was okay. She wasn't doing this for the approval of others. She was doing it for the people who didn't have a voice, for the countless others who faced the same kind of injustice every day. Her job, her mission, had always been about something bigger than herself. This was just one chapter in that larger story. She continued to work with her team, keeping her focus on the task at hand. The investigation into the officer's actions was progressing, and more evidence was being gathered. The footage from the gas station security cameras was being analyzed frame by frame, and the body camera footage from the officer's patrol car had been scrutinized in detail. They were building a case, one that would not only hold the officer accountable, but send a message to others in positions of power. It was during one of these meetings that the woman was reminded of the importance of her work. Sitting across from her colleagues reviewing the evidence, she was struck by the realization that this was the moment for change. This was where they had the power to make a difference. The evidence was clear, and the public support was undeniable. Now it was time to follow through. "I know this has been tough," her supervisor said, breaking the silence, "but we're making progress. We've got the evidence we need. We've got the public's attention. Now we need to keep pushing." The woman nodded, though she felt a heavy weight on her shoulders. The push for justice wasn't going to be easy. The system was built to protect its own, and no matter how solid their case was, there would always be forces working to undermine it. But she had seen it before. She had seen the way things could change when the right people stood up and refused to back down. And that was what she intended to do. As the weeks passed, the case against the officer continued to build. More details emerged, revealing a pattern of behavior that was troubling, to say the least. He had a history of complaints against him, with several instances of racial profiling and excessive use of force. These were things the public didn't know, but they would soon. The woman's bravery in speaking out had opened a door, and now the world was seeing just how deep the problems ran within the department. At the same time, the woman began to realize something else, something she hadn't fully understood before. This was not just about the officer. This was about the system as a whole. The officer was a symptom of a larger issue, a problem that ran far deeper than one individual's actions. It was about the way law enforcement interacted with communities, especially communities of color. It was about the way people in power too often use their authority to control and intimidate, rather than protect and serve. She began to spend more time talking with her colleagues, discussing ways they could address these larger issues. They weren't just fighting for justice in one case, they were fighting for change in an entire system. It was a daunting task, one that would require years of work and dedication. But it was also one that she knew they had to undertake. The stakes were too high and the need for change was too great. Meanwhile, the officer's fate hung in the balance. The department had placed him on paid leave and the internal investigation was ongoing. It was clear to everyone involved that his actions would not go unpunished, but the woman couldn't help but feel that the system was going to protect him, as it had protected others before him. She had seen it too many times. Officers who had abused their power only to be given a slap on the wrist or worse, quietly allowed to continue their work without facing real consequences. But this time was different. She had a voice now, and she wasn't going to let the officer slip through the cracks. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else get away with it. She had seen the damage that unchecked power could do, and she was determined to make sure this case would be different. One afternoon, as she was leaving the office, her phone rang. It was her supervisor again. "Listen," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We just got word that the officer is planning to fight the charges. He's hired a lawyer, and they're preparing to take this to court. It's going to be a long fight." The woman felt a pang of frustration. She had expected this, but hearing it aloud made it all the more real. This wasn't going to be easy. The officer's lawyer would likely try to discredit her testimony, to paint her as an unreliable witness. It was a tactic they had seen time and time again. Attack the credibility of the victim to shift the focus away from the crime. She steeled herself. She had been through tough situations before, but this was different. She was fighting not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," she said, her voice firm. "We've got the truth on our side. We can't back down now." Her supervisor agreed, and the two of them made a plan to prepare for the upcoming legal battle. It would be long and grueling, but they both knew it was necessary. The officer had chosen to fight, and now they would fight back with everything they had. As the legal process unfolded, the media continued to cover the case, keeping the public informed. The pressure on the department was growing, and the voices calling for reform were getting louder. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about the culture of policing, about the need for accountability and transparency. The woman watched all of this unfold with a sense of determination. She had no intention of backing down. This case, this fight, had become bigger than just the officer. It was about making sure that something like this never happened again. It was about ensuring that every person, no matter their race or background, could walk into a gas station or any public space without fear of being targeted simply because of who they were. It was a fight she knew she couldn't win alone. But she wasn't alone. She had her team, her colleagues, and the support of the public behind her, and together, they would keep pushing for justice no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The legal battle had been dragging on for weeks. The courtroom had become a place where each side fought not only for justice but for their own narrative. The officer, with his defense team, tried to paint a picture of the events that night as one of confusion, of a misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. They tried to discredit the woman's testimony, questioning her motives and painting her as someone who had provoked the situation. It was a strategy they had used before, one that aimed to shift the blame from the officer to the victim. But the woman wasn't backing down. She had been through too much to let the officer or anyone else make her doubt herself. She stood firm in her testimony, speaking clearly about the events of that night and the impact it had on her, not just as an agent, but as a human being. She spoke about the fear, the anger, and the feeling of being violated. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She told it like it was. And despite the attempts to undermine her, her story remained unshaken. As the weeks wore on, the pressure on both sides continued to build. The media coverage, which had initially been overwhelming, had settled into a constant hum. It wasn't just about one woman's experience anymore. It was about the larger conversation surrounding police misconduct, racial profiling, and the need for reform. People were watching and they wanted answers. They wanted justice. On the defense side, the officer's lawyer continued to try to make the case that the officer had acted in self-defense, that he had felt threatened, and that the punch had been a reflex. But it was clear to everyone involved that this wasn't about self-defense, it was about power. The officer had used his position to intimidate and control. He had relied on the belief that he could do whatever he wanted and that no one would challenge him. But now that belief was crumbling. The evidence was clear, and the public support for the woman was undeniable. She had become a symbol of resistance against the very system that had allowed officers like this to abuse their power for far too long. And though the case was still ongoing, the momentum was shifting in her favor. One afternoon, after another round of testimony, the woman received a call from her supervisor. His voice was calm but firm, as always. "I need you to come in," he said. "We've got an update." When she arrived at the office, the atmosphere was tense. Her colleagues were gathered around a table, their faces serious. She could sense that something significant had happened. Her supervisor looked up as she entered, motioning for her to take a seat. "We've just received word that the officer is going to plead guilty," he said. "He's accepted a plea deal." The woman's heart skipped a beat. It was a relief, but it was also a complicated feeling. She had known that this was a possibility, but to hear it confirmed was still difficult to process. The officer's guilt was a victory, but it wasn't the kind of victory she had imagined. There was no sense of triumph, no sense of vindication. It was simply the right thing to do. The plea deal meant that the officer would avoid jail time, but he would lose his job, his pension, and his ability to work in law enforcement again. It was a significant punishment, but it felt small compared to the damage he had caused. He had taken her dignity, her sense of security, and had inflicted emotional scars that would take time to heal. But at least now he would have to live with the consequences of his actions, and the public would know that the system had worked, at least this time. "I'll take it," the woman said quietly, her voice steady but her thoughts racing. "But this doesn't end here." Her supervisor nodded. "No, it doesn't. This is just one step in a much larger fight. We still have work to do." The woman spent the next few days reflecting on everything that had happened: the investigation, the hearing, the trial, and now the plea deal. There had been so many ups and downs, so many moments where she had questioned whether this was all worth it. But now, as the case came to an end, she felt a sense of clarity. She had fought for what was right, and she had made a difference. The officer had been held accountable, and the public conversation about police reform was continuing to grow. She had contributed to that change, and that was something she could be proud of. But she also knew that this wasn't the end. There were still so many people who needed to be heard, so many communities still facing the same injustices that she had experienced. The officer's actions had been a symptom of a much larger problem. The system needed to change, and she was going to be part of that change. She decided to take some time for herself, to recharge after the long months of legal battles and public scrutiny. She spent time with her family, enjoyed moments of peace that had been hard to come by during the intense media attention. But even in those quiet moments, the weight of the work still hung over her. She knew that she couldn't step away for too long. There was still too much to be done. As the weeks passed, the case became a turning point for many people. The department took steps to address some of the issues that had been exposed during the investigation, including mandatory retraining for officers on racial bias and use of force. While it wasn't the sweeping reform that many had hoped for, it was a start. It was a small step in the right direction, one that gave hope to those who had been fighting for change for so long. The woman continued her work, now more determined than ever to make a difference. She knew that this case had been just one chapter in the larger story of injustice, but it had been an important chapter. And while there was still so much work left to be done, she was ready to keep fighting. She had faced down fear and doubt, had confronted the system head-on, and had come out stronger on the other side. As she moved forward, she carried with her the lessons of this experience, the importance of speaking out, of standing up for what was right, and of never letting the system silence those who needed to be heard. She had fought for justice, and though it had been a hard-won battle, she knew that it was a battle worth fighting.